The woman's voice cut through the cabin, sharp and urgent. "I just don't feel safe sitting here." All eyes turned as Isaiah Brooks slowly reached into his jacket, pulling out a badge that silenced the entire plane in an instant. In that frozen moment, everyone realized the real danger had never been him, it was their own assumptions. The air around Gate C-12 was thick with that familiar tiredness, a mix of stale coffee, fried breakfast sandwiches, and the faint anxiety of people who had somewhere to be but nowhere else to go just yet. Rolling suitcases bumped against scuffed tile floors, shoes tapped with restless energy, and phones lit up with endless scrolling meant to kill the drag of waiting. The overhead speakers crackled to life, the voice slightly too loud, slightly too chipper, announcing, "Now boarding, Group 1 for Flight 482 to Boston Logan. First-class passengers, you are welcome to board at this time." From the loosely gathered crowd, a man stepped forward, not rushing, not dragging his feet, just moving with a kind of quiet certainty that caught the eye without demanding it. Isaiah Brooks, 41, dark-skinned smooth except for the close-cropped beard that lined his strong jaw, wore a navy blazer over a simple gray Henley, pressed slacks, clean sneakers that looked like they'd walked a few too many airports, and carried a battered leather laptop bag slung over his shoulder. In one hand, he tucked a worn paperback copy of The Souls of Black Folk under his arm, the edges frayed, the spine softened by too many rereads. The gate agent gave him a polite smile. Isaiah nodded back, nothing loud, no big energy, just a man moving through a familiar system. He made his way down the jet bridge, stepping into the stale recycled air of the cabin. A glance around, the usual rows humming under the fluorescent lighting, overhead bins yawning open as passengers wrestled with two big carry-ons, flight attendants flashing tight professional smiles. First-class row, seat 1A, window side. Isaiah slid into it, set his bag neatly under the seat in front of him, buckled his belt, and cracked open his book with the ease of a man who had done this dance too many times to count. The world around him faded as W.E.B. Du Bois' words pulled him in like they always did. A few minutes later, the other half of his row filled. Meredith Caldwell. She looked every bit the woman who had never had to sprint to catch a flight in her life, 52, manicured nails, a structured ivory trench coat probably worth more than most people's rent, pearl earrings that gleamed under the cabin lights, and stiletto heels that clearly weren't designed for the wear and tear of Terminal C. She placed her designer tote in the overhead bin with a gentle pat, then sat down with the grace of someone used to making entrances without fanfare. Isaiah didn't look up. He didn't need to. He felt the shift. That tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of the air beside him, the way her body stiffened for just a breath too long. He stayed with his book, flipping a page slowly. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the way her scarf was adjusted unnecessarily, the way she crossed her legs, uncrossed them, crossed them again. The glances started small, almost disguised as casual. A flick of her gaze to his shoes, to his hands, to the title of the book he was reading. Then away. Then back again, just a little too quick, like a rubber band snapping. He kept reading. It wasn't new. Not to him. He knew the dance, the polite side eyes, the assessing once-overs, the silent cataloging of what he looked like versus what she expected to find sitting in first class. A flight attendant, a young woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, came through offering water. Isaiah accepted with a quiet thank you, while Meredith declined, her voice tight, strained into a brittle smile. She shifted again, her elbow almost brushing his but jerking away like she might catch something. The boarding process dragged. Through the window, Isaiah watched ground crew workers in neon vests wave their bright batons at luggage carts weaving between the metal giants parked along the tarmac. Another page turned. Another glance from her. Another adjustment of her coat. Then, movement. Out of the corner of his eye, Isaiah caught Meredith flagging down the same flight attendant. She leaned in close, voice low but not quite low enough. "Excuse me," she said, voice the kind you use when asking for something you already feel entitled to receive. "I was wondering, is there any chance I could move seats?" The attendant looked surprised, polite confusion flickering across her face. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I think we're pretty full up here today." May I ask if there's an issue with your seat? Meredith hesitated, her eyes darting for just a split second toward Isaiah before flitting away like a guilty thought. No, no, she said too quickly. It's not the seat, exactly. I'm just feeling a little uncomfortable. Personal reasons. The attendant nodded, professional but puzzled. I'll check with the cabin lead and see what I can do once boarding is complete, she said gently. Meredith sat back stiffly, hands tightening in her lap. Isaiah closed his book, not abruptly, not aggressively, just calmly, and turned his head toward her. His voice when he spoke was low, even, the kind of calm that came from years of knowing that no matter how soft you spoke, your presence alone could be interpreted as something else. Is there something you want to ask me? He said. Meredith blinked, clearly not expecting him to address it directly. Her mouth opened, then closed. She shook her head quickly, the movement too jerky to be convincing. No, of course not. It's nothing. Isaiah nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. All right, he said simply, and turned his gaze back to the window. But the energy between them had shifted, thickened. And now other passengers, those in the rows behind, those slipping into the aisle seats, were starting to feel it too. Heads turned subtly, glances exchanged across seats. The air was changing, and not because the engines were revving. Phones were slid into seatbacks, conversations dipped lower. Instinct had sharpened the cabin's atmosphere, even if most didn't know yet what their bodies were responding to. Meredith adjusted her scarf again, tugged at the sleeves of her coat, crossed her arms tightly over her chest as if to shrink herself, though it was never really about making herself smaller. It was about erasing the thing that unsettled her. Isaiah let out a slow, steady breath and leaned his head lightly against the window. They hadn't even closed the cabin doors yet, and already the flight had started, just not the one everyone thought they had signed up for. The engines hummed deeper now, a low steady roar building beneath the cabin as Flight 482 pushed back from the gate, the sudden lurch making seatbelts snap taut and overhead bins rattle faintly. Isaiah felt the slight shift in gravity but barely moved, keeping his head tilted against the cool window, book resting loosely in his lap, thumb tucked between pages. Across the narrow divide of the armrest, Meredith sat rigid, her body language wound tighter than a coiled spring. Her fingers fidgeted restlessly with the clasp of her designer tote, her knee bouncing under the glossy fabric of her slacks in a frantic rhythm she clearly wasn't aware of. As the plane taxied slowly along the runway, the collective rustle of passengers settling into their seats filled the cabin, but the space between seats 1A and 1B remained charged, dense with an invisible tension that neither the captain's cheerful announcements nor the flight attendant's brisk professionalism could smooth away. Isaiah could feel her side eyes slicing the air again, furtive, assessing, loaded. He sighed inwardly. He had given her an out, a clean way to reset before they even left the ground, but she hadn't taken it. Some people never did. Sometimes it wasn't about what you said, it was about what they had already decided to believe. The plane jerked once more, then paused, engines revving higher. Clearance was coming. Takeoff imminent. Isaiah closed his eyes, willing himself to focus on his breathing, counting each slow inhale and exhale the way he'd been taught during endless field trainings. 3 beats in, 5 beats out. Ignore it. Let it slide off you like rain. But then he heard it, the crisp unfastening of Meredith's seatbelt, the rustle of her trench coat as she twisted toward the aisle. She was flagging down a flight attendant again, but this time, she wasn't whispering quite so carefully. The young attendant from earlier bent down, listening intently as Meredith leaned in, her voice a strained thread of discomfort. "I'm sorry," Meredith said, loud enough for Isaiah to catch now. "But I really don't feel comfortable. I need to move seats." The attendant frowned, glancing sideways at Isaiah before schooling his expression back to neutral. "Ma'am, as I mentioned before, the flight is full. After takeoff, I can see what arrangements might be possible, but for now, please return to your seat." Meredith's mouth tightened, her face flushing a blotchy pink. She nodded sharply but didn't hide the resentment twisting in her features. She sat back, snapped her belt on, and clasped her hands in her lap so tightly her knuckles went white. Isaiah opened his eyes fully now, fixing his gaze straight ahead, willing himself not to shake his head, not to smirk, not to give her one more ounce of ammunition to twist into something it wasn't. The engines roared, pressing them into their seats, and Flight 482 lifted off into the heavy gray morning, wheels leaving concrete, climbing into a smear of low clouds. 30 seconds of weight and force, then the leveling out, the soft ding of the seatbelt sign flicking off. Isaiah exhaled slowly, tucked his book away into the pocket of the seat in front of him, and leaned back, ready to settle in for the flight. But peace wasn't in the cards. He heard the whisper first, Meredith's voice, hushed but urgent, as she motioned again to the flight attendant, this time summoning a different one, a senior woman with sharp brown eyes, hair pulled into a tight silver bun, and the no-nonsense posture of someone who had seen everything an airplane cabin could offer and wasn't impressed by much of it anymore. "I need to speak to the supervisor," Meredith insisted. Her voice trembled now, the kind of tremble that begged to be seen as victimized rather than aggressive. The senior flight attendant gave a small nod, disappeared for a moment, and when she returned, she brought with her a man dressed in a tailored dark suit, crisp shirt, and a polished demeanor. That announced his authority without needing a single word. Mr. Curtis Langley. Cabin lead. Supervisor. His badge gleamed briefly as he knelt by Meredith's seat, hands clasped together in a careful, non-threatening gesture. "Good morning, ma'am," he said in a low voice. "I understand you have a concern?" Meredith latched onto the lifeline, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Yes, I don't feel safe. The man next to me, his demeanor, his energy is making me extremely uncomfortable. I asked if I could move, but no one's helping me. I don't understand why I'm being ignored when I clearly have a valid concern." Langley listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once, professional, methodical. "I hear you, ma'am," he said. Then he turned his gaze toward Isaiah. "Sir, would you mind telling me your side of things?" Isaiah met his eyes without hesitation. His voice when it came was even, low, but laced with the kind of exhaustion that only living too long under suspicion can teach you. "I boarded. Sat in my assigned seat. Opened my book." She started acting uneasy. "I asked if she had a question for me. She said no. And now apparently my existence is a problem." Langley held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, then gave a small nod. "Sir," he said carefully, "may I ask to see a form of identification?" The request didn't sting. Not anymore. It was just another brick in a wall Isaiah had been scaling his whole life. Without speaking, Isaiah unfastened his belt, reached into his inner jacket pocket, and pulled out a black leather badge holder. With a flick of his thumb, he opened it to reveal the gold and blue shield of the Department of Homeland Security, shining quietly in the overhead light. Special Agent Isaiah Brooks. The reaction was instant, electric, tangible. Meredith's face crumpled first, an ugly collapsing of color, her skin going bloodless, her lips pressing into a hard, thin line of shock. Around them, a wave of realization spread through first class like a ripple in a pond. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone let out an audible breath, the kind you don't realize you're holding until it escapes. Langley straightened immediately, his voice dropping into a more deferential register. "Thank you, Agent Brooks," he said, crisp and respectful. "I appreciate your cooperation." Isaiah gave a short nod, tucking the badge away without ceremony. He leaned back in his seat, resting his elbow on the armrest, fixing Meredith with a gaze so calm, so steady, it was almost surgical. Meredith opened her mouth like she might defend herself, might find some new excuse buried in the wreckage of her assumptions, but no words came. Just a choked half-breath and a furious blinking of her mascaraed eyes. The silence between them now wasn't just thick, it was absolute, a heavy oppressive thing that pressed against every seat back, every overheard compartment. Meredith finally found her voice, small and cracked. I didn't know," she said. "Didn't know what?" Isaiah asked quietly. She blinked again, lost, floundering. I didn't know you were with the government. Her words trailed off into nothingness. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed soft, controlled. You didn't know I wasn't a threat. That's what you mean. The faintest tremor of shame crossed her face. Isaiah let the silence hang, a lesson, a weight she would have to carry on her own. He didn't owe her an easier exit. Around them, passengers pretended not to listen but couldn't tear their eyes away. They had all seen it happen. They had all felt it ripple through the cabin like a sudden temperature drop. Meredith Caldwell, polished and poised, exposed in the kind of vulnerability no designer trench coat could cover. And Isaiah Brooks, calm, dignified, yet forced to wield proof of his own legitimacy like armor. Meredith whispered again, more to herself than to him, I didn't mean to. Isaiah gave the faintest shake of his head. But you did. He turned away, facing the window again, watching the endless clouds blur past, a silent witness to a conversation unfinished but fully understood. The flight droned on, but the cabin had changed. The air itself seemed heavier, not because of turbulence or altitude but because the truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. And there was no unseeing it now. The hum of Flight 482 cruising above the cloud line filled the heavy silence between seats 1A and 1B, a steady mechanical breath that seemed louder now than it had before. Isaiah kept his gaze fixed out the window, watching the endless quilt of white cloud stretch below them like an untouched wilderness, while beside him Meredith sat stiff and shrinking into her seat, the weight of what had just happened pressing down harder than the altitude. She hadn't said another word since he tucked the badge away, and he hadn't asked for one. There was nothing left to clarify. Nothing he could say that would scrape off the raw discomfort she now wore like a second skin. And that was fine. Isaiah wasn't interested in her comfort. Not anymore. He shifted slightly, resting his elbow against the armrest, his fingers idly tapping against the hem of his jacket in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Around them, the other passengers tried and failed to pretend they hadn't witnessed it all. Some snapped glances when they thought he wouldn't notice, others kept their heads ducked down into magazines or phone screens, pretending to read, pretending to work, pretending they hadn't been part of the silent tribunal that had hung him in their minds before the truth had forced them to reckon with it. The flight attendants moved mechanically down the aisle with the beverage cart, offering thin smiles and small plastic cups like peace offerings. When they reached row 1, the younger attendant, the one who had first tried to handle the situation, paused for a beat too long, his tray balanced awkwardly between them. Something to drink, sir? He asked, his voice clipped, neutral. Isaiah gave a small nod. Water, thanks. The attendant poured, his hand steady, his eyes flickering between Isaiah and Meredith. When he turned to her, Meredith shook her head almost violently, murmuring, I'm fine, her voice barely audible. The cart rattled away, and the hum of the engine swallowed up the moment like it was nothing. Isaiah twisted the cap off the bottle, took a sip, and leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. The exhaustion wasn't physical. It was heavier than that, layered deep, the kind that builds up over years of always having to be the one who stays calm, stays poised, stays small enough not to threaten, big enough not to be overlooked, polite enough not to escalate, sharp enough not to miss the signs when it happens anyway. He wasn't tired because of her. He was tired because he had seen it all before. Different faces, same story. 15 minutes passed like that, measured only by the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups, the dry crackle of intercom announcements, and the shifting bodies of strangers trying to outrun the discomfort now stitched into the flight itself. Meredith sat frozen, her hands folded tightly over her lap, her eyes locked on the back of the seat in front of her like it could offer her a roadmap out of the wreckage. Every so often, she would inhale sharply, as if bracing herself to speak, but no words ever came. Isaiah didn't rush her. He wasn't waiting for an apology. Whether it came or not, the truth had already landed harder than any plane ever could. But somewhere above Ohio, with the seatbelt sign flickering on again in preparation for descent, Meredith finally found her voice, raw and low. I'm sorry, she said, the word small but unmistakably real this time. Isaiah didn't immediately react. He opened his eyes slowly, turned his head just enough to meet hers. She was looking at him now, not glancing, not stealing peeks, but really looking, seeing the man she hadn't bothered to see before. Not because you're DHS, she added quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. Not because of the badge. Because I realized what I did. And it was wrong. Her throat worked around the admission, her hands clenching harder in her lap. I thought I wasn't that kind of person. I thought I trusted my instincts. I never thought, she broke off, her voice catching, frustration and shame tangling into one jagged breath. Isaiah watched her for a moment, weighing her words not for their sound but for their weight. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Seeing it, he said quietly, is a start. Meredith blinked fast, the shine in her eyes betraying just how much the admission cost her. Isaiah turned back toward the window. He didn't need more. He didn't need to force forgiveness onto the moment like a band-aid over a wound that needed time to scar. Sometimes the best you could hope for was that someone would sit with the discomfort long enough to remember it. The landing was smooth, the tires screeching briefly against the tarmac at Boston Logan before settling into a steady rumble. As the plane taxied toward the gate, there was a collective release across the cabin, a subtle shifting of bodies, a stirring of relief that came not just from the end of the flight but from the permission to move again, to get away from whatever had made them all complicit witnesses. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Passengers sprang up with the usual frantic urgency, snatching bags from overhead bins, chattering about meetings and dinners and connecting flights. But in row 1, both Isaiah and Meredith remained seated. Meredith glanced at him again, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name, maybe forgiveness, maybe permission to move past it. Isaiah offered nothing more than a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement that she had faced something most people ran from. It was enough. She stepped into the aisle, clutching her tote to her chest, and joined the slow-moving river of bodies exiting the plane. Isaiah waited until the aisle was almost clear before standing, slinging his laptop bag over his shoulder, moving with the easy pace of a man who knew he was still being watched even after the confrontation was over. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. In the terminal, amid the swirl of tired travelers and flashing monitors and rolling suitcases, he spotted her, a young black girl, maybe 12 or 13, wearing a burgundy Harvard sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and a backpack weighed down with keychains and dreams. She stood by the arrivals board, shifting nervously from foot to foot, her wide eyes scanning the crowd. When she caught sight of Isaiah's badge clipped discreetly to his belt, her whole face lit up like a sunrise breaking over dark water. She stared, open-mouthed, then gave a shy little wave. Isaiah smiled, small, genuine, and walked over just close enough to lean down slightly, speaking in a voice meant just for her. "Stay sharp," he said, tapping 2 fingers lightly against the brim of his cap in a half-salute. "You'll get there." The girl beamed, the kind of grin that could power an entire city block, and Isaiah kept walking, his own steps a little lighter now. Behind him, the terminal swallowed her back into its endless tide, but he knew she would remember. Maybe she would remember that someone who looked like her could stand tall, carry authority, demand respect without apology. Maybe she would remember that sometimes the biggest battles are fought without shouting, without fists, without grand speeches, just by existing where some people think you don't belong. Isaiah walked through the crowds, the polished tile floors glinting under the fluorescent lights, the hum of announcements and laughter and arguments swirling around him. But inside, he carried a stillness, a certainty that no badge could ever create and no assumption could ever erase. Respect wasn't something you should have to prove. Humanity wasn't something you should have to earn. Titles, uniforms, badges, they were tools, not shields. They shouldn't be the price of being seen as a full person. They shouldn't be the currency required just to sit, to read, to breathe, to exist without suspicion. The next time, he knew, it might not end with a flash of gold and a stunned apology. It might end harder, harsher, with fewer witnesses willing to admit what they saw. And that was why he kept walking forward, always forward, carving space where others might hesitate, so that the ones coming after him wouldn't have to fight the same battles in the same endless loops. Maybe one day, a man could board a plane with a book and a bag and nothing else, and that would be enough. No stairs. No questions. No proof demanded. Maybe one day. But until then, Isaiah Brooks would carry the weight quietly, steadily, like he always had. Because somewhere out there, a little girl in a Harvard sweatshirt had seen him. And that made every step worth it. In the story you just heard, Isaiah Brooks didn't raise his voice. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't have to. His calm dignity spoke volumes louder than any confrontation ever could. But the real lesson isn't in how he responded, it's in why he had to respond at all. Isaiah carried proof of his worth not because he needed it, but because he knew the world too often demanded it from people who looked like him. That's the part that should make us all pause. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself in loud, ugly ways. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles, quiet discomfort, or gut feelings that whisper about danger where none exists. It often shows up when we assume without asking, when we judge without knowing, when we act without ever stopping to question why we feel uneasy around someone who simply doesn't fit our expectation of who belongs. This story reminds us that true change doesn't happen at 30,000 feet, it happens in our everyday choices. It happens when we catch ourselves making assumptions and choose to think deeper instead. It happens when we recognize that respect and dignity are not things people should have to earn through titles, uniforms, or credentials. They are basic rights, owed to every human being from the start. If there's one thing to take away from Isaiah's journey, it's this: real courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like refusing to justify your existence, refusing to apologize for who you are. And sometimes, it looks like standing tall with the simple, powerful belief that you belong, without needing anyone else's permission. And to those of us listening, it's a call to be better. To slow down before we judge. To question the stories our fears try to tell us. And to remember that the first step toward justice isn't about calling out others, it's about looking inward first. On behalf of U.S. Justice Story, I want to sincerely thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart, and for walking this journey of reflection with us. If today's story touched you, if it made you think, or even made you a little uncomfortable, that's good. Growth often starts with discomfort. Please consider sharing this message with someone else who might need it. And remember, every time we choose to see each other fully and fairly, we take one more step toward a better world. Thank you for being part of that change. We see you. We hear you. You matter.